Ahmed's weathered hands gripped the rope that connected him to his past life. Behind him, wrapped in faded blue cloth, lay everything he owned in this world. 2 children who trusted him completely, and a woman whose sharp tongue had kept them alive for 3 days now. The morning sun painted the endless dunes in shades of gold and amber. Each grain of sand seemed to mock their desperate situation. Ahmed squinted against the glare, his cracked lips moving in silent prayer. The children, Layla and Omar, sat quietly on the makeshift sled he had fashioned from pieces of their destroyed truck. Their dark eyes watched him with the kind of faith that made his chest tight with responsibility. "Water," whispered 5-year-old Layla, her small voice barely audible above the wind that never seemed to stop in this cursed place. Omar, only 3, had stopped asking hours ago. The boy simply stared ahead with the patience of someone much older, his tiny hand clutching a wooden toy camel that somehow survived the crash. Fatima, Ahmed's wife, walked beside them with steps that spoke of determination born from desperation. Her face remained hidden beneath her headscarf, but her voice carried clearly across the wasteland. She had become their navigator, their voice of reason, their keeper of hope when his own began to fade. "The truck should never have taken that route," she murmured, not for the first time. Ahmed said nothing. They both knew the smugglers had lied about the safe passage to the border. They both knew the truck had been overloaded with desperate families seeking a better life. They both knew that when the ancient vehicle finally died in the middle of nowhere, most passengers had chosen different directions to walk. Ahmed and Fatima had chosen east, toward where they believed the main road lay. Now, 72 hours later, the landscape looked exactly the same in every direction. Rolling hills of sand stretched beyond the horizon, broken only by occasional patches of stubborn desert grass, and rocks worn smooth by centuries of wind. The sled moved slowly behind Ahmed, leaving a trail that the wind would erase within minutes. His shoulders ached from pulling the weight, but he had fashioned the contraption carefully. Old truck parts served as runners, while torn seat cushions provided padding for the children. Rope salvaged from the wreckage held everything together, including their remaining supplies: 1 plastic bottle half filled with warm water, a small bag of dates, and Fatima's medical kit from her years working as a nurse. "Tell us about the city again, Mama," Layla requested, her voice dreamy with exhaustion and hope. Fatima glanced at Ahmed before answering. They had agreed to keep the children focused on their destination rather than their current suffering. "The city has fountains everywhere," Fatima began, her voice taking on a storytelling rhythm that had comforted the children since birth. "Clean water flows freely, and children play in parks with green grass and tall trees that provide shade." Omar lifted his head slightly, interested despite his weariness. "Trees bigger than Papa?" "Much bigger," Fatima confirmed. "Trees so tall you have to lean back to see the top. And the buildings reach toward the sky like mountains made by people." Ahmed adjusted his grip on the rope and continued pulling. The story was for the children, but it helped him too. Somewhere beyond this sea of sand lay safety, medical care, schools, and a chance for his family to build something better than the life they had fled. The war had taken their home, their neighborhood, and most of their friends. Ahmed's small shop had been destroyed in the bombing that killed their next-door neighbors. After that, staying meant watching his children grow up surrounded by violence and uncertainty. Leaving meant risking everything on a journey that might kill them all. Now, as the sun climbed higher and the sand began to shimmer with heat, Ahmed wondered if he had made the right choice. The truck breakdown had not been part of any plan. Neither had walking through the desert with 2 small children and limited supplies. "Look," Fatima said suddenly, pointing ahead. "Rocks." Ahmed raised his head and saw them, a cluster of large boulders rising from the sand like ancient monuments. After walking for hours with nothing but endless dunes, the sight of anything different felt like a gift. "Shade," he said, the word coming out as a prayer. They reached the rocks as the sun reached its peak. Ahmed pulled the sled into the shadow cast by the largest boulder, and immediately felt the temperature drop by several degrees. The children smiled for the first time that day, wiggling off the sled to explore their temporary shelter. Fatima examined their water supply, while Ahmed checked the rope and sled for damage. The makeshift vehicle had held together well, but the constant friction against sand had worn grooves in the metal runners. "Half a bottle left," Fatima reported quietly, holding up their water container. Ahmed nodded without looking at her. They both knew it was not nearly enough. "How far do you think we have walked?" she asked. Ahmed considered the question seriously. They had no map, no compass, and no way to measure distance except by time and effort. "Maybe 20 kilometers since yesterday morning." "The main road has to be close," Fatima said, but her voice carried more hope than conviction. Layla found a small lizard sunning itself on a rock and called excitedly for her parents to see. Omar discovered that their shelter created an echo, and he spent several minutes calling out simple words to hear them bounce back. For a brief moment, they felt like a family on an adventure rather than refugees fleeing across a deadly wasteland. Ahmed allowed them 30 minutes of rest before preparing to move again. The afternoon would be brutal, but they could not afford to stay in one place too long. Their water would not last beyond tomorrow, and every hour they remained lost was an hour closer to disaster. "Ready?" he asked, checking the rope one final time. Fatima helped the children back onto the sled, making sure they were secure and as comfortable as possible. She handed Ahmed the water bottle, and he took a small sip before passing it back. "Save it for the children," he said. "You need it too," she replied, but she did not argue further. They emerged from the shade into the blazing afternoon sun. The sand had grown hot enough to feel through their shoes, and the air shimmered with heat waves that made the distant dunes appear to dance. Ahmed began pulling again, his feet sinking slightly with each step as the sand grew softer and deeper. Behind him, Fatima began another story about the city that waited for them somewhere beyond the horizon. Ahmed listened with half his attention, while the other half focused on the rhythm of walking. Lift a foot, push forward, find solid ground, repeat. Each step carried them farther from their destroyed past and closer to an uncertain but hopefully better future. The endless dunes stretched ahead, but Ahmed no longer saw them as obstacles. They had become a test, a passage that his family would cross together. The heat, the exhaustion, and the fear were real, but so was their determination to survive. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, Ahmed felt something shift inside his chest. Not hope exactly, but a quiet certainty that they would find their way. Fatima's voice rose and fell with her stories. The children asked questions about fountains and trees, and his feet found their steady rhythm on the burning sand. They were still lost in the vastness of the desert, but they were lost together, and that made all the difference in the world. By the fourth day, Ahmed's optimism had cracked like the skin on his hands. The rope cut into his palms despite the cloth wrappings Fatima had made from torn pieces of her dress. Each pull of the sled felt heavier than the last, not because the children had gained weight, but because his strength continued to drain away with every drop of sweat that evaporated in the merciless heat. The water was gone. The last drops had been given to Omar the previous evening when the boy finally cried from thirst. Since then, they had traveled in silence broken only by the whisper of sand against metal and the sound of Ahmed's labored breathing. Fatima walked differently now. Her steps had become sharp, purposeful, like a woman who had made a decision. She no longer told stories about fountains and green trees. Instead, she studied the landscape with intense focus, occasionally stopping to examine tracks in the sand or feel the direction of the wind against her face. "There," she said suddenly, pointing toward what appeared to be empty air above a distant dune. "Birds." Ahmed squinted but saw nothing except the endless blue sky and the heat shimmer that made everything waver like water. "Where?" "3 of them. Circling." Fatima's voice carried a certainty that made Ahmed look harder. After several seconds, he spotted them, dark specks moving in lazy circles high above the sand. So, birds mean something is dead or dying. Dead things mean other animals came to feed and left tracks. Tracks mean a path. Paths lead somewhere. Fatima began walking faster, forcing Ahmed to match her pace despite his exhaustion. The children sensed the change in their parents' energy. Layla sat up straighter on the sled, while Omar clutched his wooden camel and watched the sky for the birds his mother had seen. Neither child had complained about